Hi, my name's Stuart Lynch, and this is the second video in the iOS 16 navigation series. In the first video, we learned about the navigation stack and all of its components, and in this video, we'll be extending that knowledge. We'll be extending the navigation stack another level to see how we can use the navigation path to implement a back to root button. Following that, we'll see how easy it is to use the navigation path to enable programmable navigation through DeepLinks using a custom URL scheme. I love getting your feedback, so tap the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video and leave a comment below. Make sure you subscribe to the video and ring that bell to get notifications of new videos. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. I have a starter project for this video, and I encourage you to work along with me so that when completed, you'll have an application with some reference code and examples that you can refer back to when you start to implement a navigation stack in your own projects. The starter project has no coded views, except that I renamed the content view as country list view. We'll be coding this shortly to display a list of countries. To make this a little easier to deal with, I provided a simple country model in the models file that has 4 properties: name, a string; flag, a string, which will be an emoji of the country flag; and the country population as an int. I also have an array of city where the city is another struct with 4 property names: the country that it belongs to, which is a string, and that name will match the country in the country object; a Boolean value, which will indicate if it's the capital of the country; and the city's population. And I have a static array of cities that we can use to display information about cities, and it's from this static array that I generate the cities for the static sample array of country that I generated for the country model. Each country then will have a name, a flag, a population, and for the cities, I filter the static all array of cities to find the corresponding cities for that country. In our solution, I'm going to be displaying a list of countries and eventually a list of cities, and both will be within a navigation stack. This means then I must conform both of our structs to 2 protocols: identifiable, so that it'll make it easier to present in a list, and hashable, which is a requirement for a navigation stack. So let's start with identifiable. This will require an ID property in both. Since my country names are unique, I'm just going to specify that the ID is the name. And this will work for the city struct as well. For the hashable protocol, you'll remember from the last lesson that if each of the properties of an object are hashable, we can conform the entire object to the hashable protocol. So if I start by saying that city is hashable because each of its properties are, these types are hashable types, then I can go to the country struct and conform it as well because now all 4 of its properties are hashable too. So let's update our country list view now. I'm going to start by replacing the content with a navigation stack. Within the navigation stack, I'm going to create a list view, and that's going to iterate over the country samples array, and that'll provide us with a country iterator. We can then use this to create a navigation link, and I'm going to use the overload with 2 closures, where the value is that country. For the label, we'll create an H-stack, and then within the H-stack, I'm going to create 2 text views. The first one will be a text view displaying the country flag, and the second one, another text view displaying the country name. And then I'm going to add a navigation title using the string countries. Well, now that I have a navigation link, I'll need to create a navigation destination method for this type. But first, we'll need somewhere for it to go. So I'm going to create a new SwiftUI file, and I'm going to call it country view. We'll be passing in a country when we tap on that link, so I'll create a country variable of type country. Now I can replace the text view here with a VStack with a alignment of leading. Inside the VStack, I'm going to create an HStack with 2 more views. The first one is going to be a text view displaying the country flag, and the second, another text view displaying the country name. And then I'm going to set the font here to large title. If I apply it to the HStack, it'll apply to both of the text views. Now below that, we'll create another HStack, but I'm going to start with the spacer to push the next view to the right trailing edge. And then we'll create a text view that will use a string population. And then I'm going to follow that with string interpolation to display the string representation of the population, which is an int. And then I'm going to push both views up in the VStack with a spacer. And then I'll just add some padding to the VStack. Next, I'm going to follow this with a navigation title using the string country. I should have done this sooner, but in order to see our preview, we'll need to provide it with an instance of our country. So let's just use country, and from the sample array, we'll choose index 2, which is the United Kingdom. Now, I'm not seeing that navigation title because my preview has no way of knowing that this view is presented when pushed onto a navigation stack. So I can fix that by embedding the preview in a navigation stack. And now it'll show up in the preview. Returning now to country list view, I can create my navigation destination method. Now this method will be for all country types. So we must specify country.self. And the destination will provide me with a country instance. So I can then pass this into our newly created country view. You can now see that this is a functional navigation link. One thing though, that since this destination is a trailing closure, I can remove that destination label and close off the parentheses here and rewrite it just like this with a trailing closure. That's about as simple as a navigation stack goes, 1 level deep. Well, we know that countries have cities, so on the country view, I want to add another element, and that's going to be a list of cities. And since this country view was pushed onto a navigation stack already, it is already inside a navigation view. So we can simply use this list to drill deeper to provide more information on a city if we tap on one of the items in the list. So to create that list, let's replace that spacer with the list and have it iterate over the country cities array. And it'll provide us with a city iterator. We can create a navigation link where the value is that city. And for the label, we can use a text view using the city name. Note that you don't have to embed the country view in a navigation stack, as the only way we're going to get there is by tapping on that list item in the country list view. Well, we'll need a destination here as well. So let's create a view for that first. I'm going to create a new file, Swift UI file, that I'll call City View. Similar as before, we'll be passing in a city to this view, so we'll create a property for that. In the preview then, so that we can view our design, let's add one of our cities for our country to that view. In the last view, we used the country's sample array at index 2 for our country, which was the United Kingdom, and it has an array of cities, and I can just pick from one of them. So let's say we're going to use the one at index 0, which happens to be London, which is a capital of the United Kingdom. So let's replace the text view now with a VStack. And inside there, I want to create a ZStack. Now, I only want to display something in the background layer of this ZStack if the city is capital is true. Well, if it is, I'm going to create a text view And I'm going to pick an emoji. And let me use this star here to display. Now it's pretty small, so I'm going to increase the size of that emoji to a font using a system size of 200. And for the frontmost layer in the Z stack, I'm going to create an H stack. And inside there, a text view using two properties as string interpolation. For the first, we'll use the city name. We'll follow that by a space, and then add a pair of parentheses. And then we'll enclose the city's country name inside the parentheses. And we'll set the font to a large title. Additionally, I'm going to set a frame where the height on the Z stack is to be 220. And then finally I can add a spacer to push this view up to the top. Let me add a navigation title of city. And I'll set the navigation bar title display mode to be inline in this case. And again, you can see it's not being displayed because our city view again has no idea that it's being pushed onto the navigation stack. So again, we'll simply surround our city view in the preview inside the navigation stack itself. Now this large title font here might be a bit large for smaller phones and large city names. And if we want it to be displayed on a single line, so let me just change it to a Title II font size instead. What I'd like to do now, though, below this, is add a bar chart showing all of the cities and their relative population. Now, I have a video on how to produce bar charts in iOS 16, and I'll leave a link in the notes below. It's incredibly easy, so let me just take a couple of minutes here to add a bar chart. If we want to get a list of all the cities in the same country as our selected one, you can see back in the models file that I have a computed property that will return all of the other cities in that country and return it as an array. And this is called the cities fellow cities property. So we can use that. As long as we have a city, this is going to provide us with all of the other cities within that same country. So first we'll need to import the charts framework. Then next, I can replace this spacer here with a chart. And that's going to iterate over the cities, fellow cities array, as I just mentioned. And it'll provide us with a city iterator. And we can use that to create a bar mark with X and Y encodings. For the X, we use .value, where the title key will be the tuple using the string city. And then for the value, city name. For Y, it's .value again, where the key string will be population, and the value will be the city's population. Immediately we have this bar chart, and it sure looks like London is by far the largest city from the ones that I've selected. To make the bars more distinguishable, we can use a foreground style by modifier with the value being the city, using only the city name. This creates a chart legend, which we don't really need here. So I'm going to set the chart legend's visibility to be hidden. And I'm also going to add some padding. Well, now we've got this nice view that we can get presented, so we need a navigation destination method on the country view so that we can get here. So back in country view, we'll add a navigation destination method, and it'll be for city.self type, and the destination closure will give us a city instance that we can pass on to the city view to display. Now, tapping on any city from country view will take us to that city and display the content. If we go back to Country List View, I can drill down 2 levels now. First to a country, and then from there into a city. Well, this is fine, but when I'm 2 levels deep and I want to change countries rather than just a city within that country, I have to go all the way back 2 levels. Wouldn't it be nice if we could back out all the way with a button on that deepest level back to our country list view? Well, notice we've not bound any of our navigation views to a navigation path on our navigation view. We're letting SwiftUI do that for us in the background. Well, we can change that and manage that for ourselves if we want. We just have to be able to pass it on from view to view. And the best way to do that is to create an observable object with our path being a published property, and we can inject it into the environment and use it when we need it. So let's create a new file for that, and I'm going to call it router. Inside there, I'm going to import SwiftUI. I'll create a class of the same name called router that conforms to the observable object protocol. I'll create a published property called path, and I'll instantiate it as a navigation path because we know that our navigation paths are going to have to include a country object and a city object. So it has to be heterogeneous. And then I'm also going to create a function called reset that I can call that will reinitialize that path, thus removing all of our pushed views that will take us back to the top level of the stack. So in the app entry file, which is the one marked with app main, I can create a new state object called router that's an instance of this new class. And then I can inject it into the environment. In country list view then, where our navigation stack is created, we'll need access to that path so that we can bind it to the navigation stack. So I'll create an environment object named router that is of type router. Then I'll need to fix the preview by injecting an instance here as an environment object too. Then I'll add a path argument to the navigation stack and bind it to that router's published path variable. So when we push our second country view onto the stack, there is no need to access the path variable here since we will be getting a back button that will remove the country from this path when it returns. So essentially, this is equivalent to asking the router to remove the last path item in the list of paths. So there's no need here to add an environment object. However, the environment is available to any view in the hierarchy. In City View, if we want to go back to the country, we would just tap the back button. But if we want to go all the way back to the country list, we'll need to reset our path. And since our router is in the environment, we can make it available to the City View by adding an environment object here of that router type to the view. And once again, to fix the preview, we'll need to inject an instance into the environment there. Now I can add a button below our bar chart, and I'm going to use the label Back to Countries List. And the action will simply be calling the router's reset function. I'm also going to apply a bordered button style to the button itself. Now when we test by going all the way back to the country list view, we can drill down to the second level on any country and city. But if I want to go back directly to the country list from a city for a particular country, we can just tap on that button. Now that we have a router and it's in the environment, we can enable deep linking, which relies on programmatic navigation and a custom URL scheme that's unique to our app. If we can determine by a link what view we should be drilling down to in our navigation stack, we can create a route for it and update our global path property in our router. For example, if we receive a deep link that tells us to go to a particular city, we could do that directly. But this is probably not what you want to do since that's 2 levels deep. We want to route it through the country. So first, let's create a URL scheme for our app that we'll be able to use. So select your application target and go to the Info tab. At the bottom, drop down the URL types chevron and click on the plus button to add a new URL type. Apple has created an article on defining a custom URL scheme for your app, and I'll leave a link on the description. It's really quite straightforward. First, we'll need an identifier, and it should be unique to your app. So I'm just going to copy and use our bundle identifier for this. I can paste that in this field now then, and the URL scheme has to be unique too, so I'm going to just create a string, and mine's going to be NavStack. And I can leave the role as an editor. That's all there is to it. A user can tap on a link from a message or an email, for example, and if your app is installed, it'll recognize that link and open it up and then provide that URL to your app that you can respond to. In SwiftUI, we receive that URL using the OpenURL method on our first view. And this provides us with the URL that we can inspect. In particular, there's 3 things that I want to know, so I'm going to print those out. I want to know what the URL scheme is, and I'm going to have to make sure that it's a valid one, being the nav test. I want to know what the URL host is, and I'm going to be using that for our country. And then I'm going to add another path for the city, so I'll need to know what the last path component is if there is one. So let's test this out now to see if we can send and receive a link. Now to receive and view link reception, we can make sure that our app is running first and open a terminal session. In the terminal, we can issue the command xcrun simctl for simulator control, OpenURL for the booted simulator, and then we can follow that by our link. Well, the scheme is our URL scheme, which we defined as NavStack. We follow that by : and then the next value is the host, and we're going to be using that to designate our country string, so Canada. And then we can follow that by another /, which will be our last path component to reference our city. So let's just test Vancouver. When we press return on the simulator, the first time our app receives a URL, it asks for permission to receive it. And this will only happen on the first time. When we do, we see printed to the console that I have our 3 values. The first 2 are optional, the scheme and the host, whereas the last path component is not. So we'll have to make sure that we do have a last path component if we're going to navigate down to the city. So first, let's do some guard checks on the body of our OpenURL to extract those values, the scheme and the host, if valid, for our application, and update the router path, thus triggering a navigation destination. So first, we'll guard check to see if the scheme is not optional, meaning that there is one, and at the same time that it matches our navtest scheme string, because that's the only one we want to accept. If not, we'll return. Second, we'll see if there is a host and unwrap it if it exists, and just return if it doesn't. Well, we've now found a country, and we can check to see if it's one of the ones that we have in our array of countries sample. We'll match it where the first one matches that country. So if it does match, we can issue a router reset so that no matter where we are within our app, it'll return to its base. And then we add the country to the path so that it'll direct us directly to that country view. So we could just issue a URL that would be just the navtest : with the country name. and that would just stop there at display the country. However, if we want to check the number of path components, we can find if there are exactly 2, and that would mean that there is a city as well. So if the URL path components count is equal to 2, we can assign the URL last path component to the city. And then, as we did with the country, we'll check to see if it exists as one of that country's cities. So the found country cities will check to see if it's the first one where the name is equal to that city that we found. And if so, then we'll add that to our router's path. So now there will be 2 items within our path. Let me test now by pressing the up arrow on the terminal to bring up that same command. And when I press enter, I'm taken directly down 2 levels to Vancouver. Perfect. Let me bring up that command once more and back up and just stop at a host country like, say, France. This time I'm taken directly to the country view to display France. I don't even have to have the app running, so let me stop Xcode. Let me bring up the terminal and let's add Paris to our URL of France. When I press return this time, the app actually launches and takes me directly to that path. Well, this is brilliant. If you can supply a link for your users to tap on, you can direct them to different parts of your application. Just to demonstrate this in the simulator, let's open the Reminders app. I'm going to create a new reminder and make the title a custom URL for Washington in the United States. So I start with navstack : //. Unfortunately, it wants to capitalize everything for the title, but it has to be exactly case sensitive. So I need to go back and change this to a lowercase n. So the host will be United States, but we can't use spaces. It's a URL, so we'll have to use %20 to represent the space. And then we'll follow that with a / and our final path for the city of Washington. And I'll just add that reminder. It now becomes a tappable link. Let me first double check. I'm going to swipe up and make sure that my app is removed from memory. So no smoke and mirrors here. Now I can tap on the link. Our app opens and takes us directly to the United States and Washington. Well, I hope these 2 videos on NavigationStack that gave you a good understanding of how to implement this in your own projects. If you like this video in this series, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment. Please also consider subscribing to my channel and tapping the bell to get notified of new videos as I release them. In the next video in this series, I'll start covering the navigation split view for larger devices. So make sure that you stay tuned, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.